Thanks for joining in. We're going to wait just another minute and then we'll get started. Welcome. This is Kim DuMont, Senior Program Officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. I'm joined today by our President, Adam Gamron, our Program Officer, Vivian Louis, our Communications team, Lenore Nyer and Billy Hunter, and our Director of Technology, Linda Rosano. Many thanks for tuning in. Today's webinar will focus on improving the use of research evidence in ways that benefit youth. The slides from today's presentation will be posted in about a week. Before we get started, I want to share a few logistics about the webinar technology. First, you can hear us, but we cannot hear you, and you can't hear one another. That said, you're welcome to pose questions through the question inbox within GoToWebinar. There will also be 2 occasions during the presentation where we will respond to some of your questions. But due to time constraints, we will not be able to answer them all. Second, you can listen either through the computer or the phone. Either way will work, but we found the most reliable way is to listen on the phone. To do that, just click on the telephone button on the webinar that mutes the audio coming from your computer. Sometimes it's good to mute your other devices as well. Finally, if you're having trouble with the audio, please make sure things are working on your end. Most often, that's the source of the problem. Okay, let's get started. I'm first going to walk you through a roadmap of what we're going to discuss today. I want to briefly introduce the William T. Grant Foundation and our 2 focus areas. I will then discuss the Foundation's initiative on improving the use of research evidence, including some background for this work and the initiative's key questions. We'll then pause for a few questions. In the second half of the webinar, I'll provide an overview of the review process for major research grants and offer some tips about what we look for in letters of inquiry. I'll also highlight a few resources. We'll again have time for a few more questions. The William T. Grant Foundation was founded in 1936 as a private grant-making foundation by William T. Grant, the owner of a chain of 5 and dime stores. Since our founding, the Foundation has worked to further understanding of human behavior through research. Our annual grants budget is about $10 to $12 million, and we support high-quality research that is relevant to policies and practices that affect the lives of young people ages 5 to 25. We award research grants based on our focus areas, reducing inequality, and improving the use of research evidence. Our Reducing Inequality initiative was launched in 2014 and aims to change the conversation about inequality. The defining feature of the Reducing Inequality initiative is a focus on responses to inequality, not its causes or consequences. We support studies that help us understand how programs, policies, and practices reduce inequality and outcomes among young people in the United States. Our initiative on improving the use of research evidence was launched in 2015 and aims to advance the conversation about research use. The defining feature of the Improving the Use of Research Evidence initiative is a focus on strategies for using research, not barriers. We support studies that improve the research in ways that benefit use. For both focus areas, we seek research that builds strong theory and empirical evidence. We intend that these bodies of research will inform change, but we don't expect a single study to create change. Rather, individual studies should contribute to a body of useful knowledge to help improve the lives of young people. This afternoon, we're here to learn more about the Foundation's initiative on improving the use of research evidence. But before we begin that, just a quick technical reminder for those of you who are just joining in. You can hear us, but we can't hear you. That said, you can pose questions through the question inbox in the GoToWebinar system. We will then respond to some of those questions later in the presentation. But due to time constraints, we won't be able to answer all of them. Also, we'll be making the slides from today's presentation available in a week or so. Okay, let's get started. In an ideal world, the research investments that funders make would yield knowledge that's useful to decision makers and is used in ways that improve youth outcomes. Indeed, this is the mission of the William T. Grant Foundation. But it's no easy task, and we know that several challenges exist. Too often, research is absent from policy conversations relevant to youth. Too often, decision makers' questions fail to shape research agendas. Too often, we assume research improves decision making, but we lack a strong evidence base to demonstrate the value of social science research when it is used. As a funder of research, Foundation staff are eager to find out what we can do to encourage the production of more useful evidence and to have existing research be used in ways that ultimately benefit youth. 9 years ago, this eagerness led the William T. Grant Foundation to issue its first request for proposals on the use of research evidence. In an effort to bring new insights to a long-standing problem, the Foundation shaped a research initiative based on 3 ideas. First, it focused on research users and their world. This represented a shift from a focus on advancing the rigor of research studies and simplifying its presentation. Staff suspected that better understanding the users of their research evidence would better connect research with policy and practice. The early phase of the initiative supported work to systematically study how research evidence is actually used by decision makers at the federal, state, and local levels and in intermediary organizations. Second, the Foundation shifted the focus from frontline workers, who frequently turn over and often don't have time or authority to make decisions about research use, and placed a focus on mid-level managers and agency administrators and intermediaries. These roles were seen as more stable and having greater potential to make decisions about research evidence. They influence organizational culture, decisions about adopting new programs and practices, and allocate resources. Third, the Foundation also viewed research as having varied roles. Research, which we define as empirical evidence derived from systematic methods and analyses to address a predefined question, might be used to help understand a problem, guide improvements, generate solutions, or advocate for an idea. This approach encouraged new questions about how and why research is used. Since then, we've funded nearly 40 studies. These studies have deepened the field's understanding of how decision makers engage with research and the conditions under which research is used. They highlighted the dynamic nature of research use and shed light on the many factors that shape what research is sought, how it's shared, the way it's evaluated, and how it shapes thinking and the decision-making process. These considerations and different types of evidence, which research is just one of those, are considered and made sense of mindful of an organization's goals, clients, routines, and resources. For example, Larry Palinkas and his colleagues examined how research is used in child welfare agencies to support the role of evidence-based programs as they are rolled out. He found that middle managers immersed in this effort placed a high priority on local data and staff capacity to use research. When the research evidence fit with the system priorities and available resources, such as providing guidance on how to roll out the evidence-based program, it was valued and used. And in turn, the use of research was associated with the timely and high-quality implementation of these programs. Given our deeper understanding of the potential users of research and their world, but continuing gaps about how to create the conditions that foster use, we refreshed our call for proposals in late 2015. At that time, we announced a new path and called for systematic studies to improve the use of research evidence. We now want to know what it takes to create the conditions to improve the use of research evidence and what happens when it's used. We have prioritized 3 lines of inquiry that we feel will move us closer to the ultimate goal of using research in ways that inform policy and practice and improve outcomes for young people. These include studies to identify and test strategies to improve the use of existing research evidence, studies to identify and test strategies for producing new research evidence that is useful, and studies that investigate whether using high-quality research improves decision-making and ultimately outcomes for youth. We remain interested in research use involved but by state and local decision makers and intermediaries. State and local departments of education, child welfare, and juvenile justice make decisions that influence frontline practices and ultimately affect youth outcomes. Mid-level managers within these agencies often decide which programs and tools to adopt, how to approve, and how to allocate resources. An intermediary organization that sits between the research producers and those who are using research for policy and practice shapes the production of research and translate and package it for use. Although many individuals are working to leverage research to inform policy and practice, we need more systematic studies of these efforts. Now, let's take a few minutes to consider each line of inquiry. We are interested in systematic studies to identify, create, and test the structural and social conditions that foster more routine and constructive uses of research evidence. We expect that these studies will build on prior work about the conditions that foster use. Existing studies provide important examples and empirical evidence about the processes, relationships, and structures that are associated with the use of research evidence. In this case, investigators might draw on work by the Foundation's grantees or explore the fields of knowledge translation and mobilization, which have a long and strong history of developing strategies to advance knowledge. An example of such a study might be drawing on prior research, which suggests that opportunities for discussions about research and active deliberation of research foster value for research and deep understanding. Providing opportunities for formal and informal discussions seem critical. Studies are now needed to determine how to create the venues and processes that deepen understanding of research and to evaluate the effectiveness of these strategies. Another idea is to build on what we know about the importance of networks in sharing research evidence and introduce strategies to optimize those networks and their use of research evidence. We are also interested in strategies for producing new research evidence that's more useful. Here we imagine that we'll need studies to create and test the incentives and structures and relationships that facilitate the production of research that responds to decision makers' needs. Again, our hope is that investigators will build on the available evidence about the conditions that stimulate research agendas that are responsive to decision makers' questions. This might include work from organizational theory about introducing and sustaining changes to help researchers move closer to the questions of practice, or the long and emerging tradition on research-practice partnerships. For example, we know that research is more likely to be used when it's viewed by policymakers as sensitive to their local context. An outstanding question is whether funders' efforts to incentivize joint work leads to more policy-relevant research that is in turn then used in decision-making. The third line of research is a bit different, and here we seek knowledge about the impacts of using high-quality research. We imagine this will take the form of studies that question whether and under what conditions using high-quality research improves decision-making and youth outcomes. We imagine that it's not sufficient for youth research alone to lead to better outcomes. Rather, we suspect that relationships between the use of research evidence and youth outcomes will be affected by a number of other conditions. These conditions might involve the degree of consensus about the body of research evidence or the capacity of staff to apply the research evidence. As an example, an observational study might examine whether states' efforts to mandate and incentivize research use results in greater engagement with research and hence changes in the practices in ways that benefit youth. Before pausing for some questions, I want to call out one promising strategy that may help make progress on several of these fronts: research-practice partnerships. Partnerships are long-term collaborations between researchers and practitioners and are mutually beneficial. Research by Cynthia Coburn and her colleagues suggests that partnerships help anchor research in the local context, help establish trust, and provide opportunities for ongoing conversations to make sense of research and integrate it with other sources. It's important to extend the good work in hypothesis testing that is already underway in this area. One outstanding question about partnerships in the area of education is how the conditions under which they operate affect the production and use of research evidence. We'll now stop and pause for a few questions.
Thanks, Kim. Some questions are starting to come in, and I know that listeners can write these questions in their chat boxes, and we'll try to take them up, as many as we can get through in the time we have allowed. One of the questions that came in was posed early on when you were first introducing the Foundation's interest, both about the Reducing Inequality Initiative and the Use of Research Evidence Initiative. So this questioner wanted to know about the extent of international research that's covered in identifying responses and strategies to reducing inequality. But I would extend the question also to our Use of Research Evidence Initiative. Can applicants propose work outside the U.S.? And what's the role of international research in our funding lines?
Okay, thanks for that great question, Adam. I think I'm going to reverse the order. And certainly we encourage researchers to draw on rich traditions and empirical studies from around the world to inform their work. So we welcome those theories in the proposal. Our focus is squarely on youth in the United States, ages 5 to 25. So this makes it quite difficult to conduct research outside of the United States.
Well, a couple of questions I think we can answer quickly. One I think you've just answered, which is when we talk about youth, we mean ages 5 to 25, so it certainly does cover 17 to 25, as one of our listeners asked. And the second is, two people have asked about getting the slides, and we will post the slides on our website very shortly after the webinar concludes, so you will have access to those slides. I know a few of them went by quickly, and so people would like to get that information, and we'll make that available to you. By the way, the content that Kim is covering today is all available in various materials in the website section on the use of research evidence. So if you want to pursue her comments further, you'll find many relevant resources there.
Sure. Hi, Kim. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to raise one of the questions that came from the audience about, can you talk more or share more about your interest in network research?
Sure. From our own foundation grantees' work, we've learned that networks are very important to the access of research, to how information gets shared, how it's understood, and how it gets applied. So we are certainly welcome for people to continue this rich tradition of studying these. And a number of folks such as Alan Daly and Carol Finnegan and others have actually thought very deeply about the qualities of network structures and what they mean for the use of research evidence. So I would refer you to their work, which we can find on our website as well.
Kim, we continue to have interest from international researchers, for example, someone asking about comparative studies. And so what I can add to what you said already is that it's possible that we would fund the U.S. portion of a comparative study, but we are not funding research on youth outside the United States. Now, another listener would like to know more about our interest in network research. And I know that's been, oh, sorry. We got that one, good. Okay, another listener would like to know whether we can apply this use of research evidence initiative to a variety of topics such as education, health, criminal justice reform, etc.
That's a great question. And yes, we welcome research on improving the use of research evidence in child welfare, in justice, in education, and in child mental health. These are all, we've funded prior work in this area, and we hope to continue to fund about these issues. We've also funded some work in the area of public health.
So another listener would like to know whether we have examples of funded research in which the target audience is involved in developing the research question and the design of the research, as well as how the results are shared.
Okay, that's a great question. So the closest I would say that we have to that are the studies that we have funded on research practice partnerships. And in this, they have done rich qualitative and mixed method work to understand the level of involvement in constructing and co-constructing those research agendas, and followed it through to understand what happens as you move forward to the research and how it gets taken up or not. Some of those studies are underway. Josh Glazier is doing some research in that area. Cynthia Colburn is doing some work in that area. Larry Palinkas has written a paper in the child welfare space about the research practice partnerships. But we haven't, under the new initiative, which we just launched last year, and we just funded our first study in October, we haven't yet had the opportunity to fund this idea.
Now, a couple of listeners have asked some pretty basic questions like, are only nonprofits eligible to receive grants from the William T. Grant Foundation? So I can say first, yes, you have to be a nonprofit to be eligible for a fund. Second, our website contains lots of information about eligibility. Here's a more substantive question. I hope you haven't already covered this. Do we have a preference for qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, multiple method studies?
Another great question. Vivian, would you like to answer this one? Sure. Thank you, Kim. Yes, we do not have a particular preference for the methods used. What we would ask of applicants is to really think about the most appropriate methods, the ones that are best suited to answer the research questions that you pose.
And I would add to that, as you think about the research questions you're posing, also think of the stage of the field's development. So it's very important that you continue to advance work that's been done. That's just another consideration in selecting the design and methods for the study. I think it would be a great time to segue to the second half of the webinar. In the first half, I focused on our initiative on improving the use of research evidence. And this can be pursued both in our major grants research program and through our William T. Grant Scholars Program. So I hope it's useful for folks who are thinking about both programs. And guidance on our Scholars Program will be released in late January. The remainder of today's webinar will present the review process for our major research grants. And I want to walk you through the process as well as highlight some of the qualities we value in those letters. Sorry, just a little technological snag. We are back on track. Maybe. Okay. Now I'm going to walk you through the review process for major research grants. Let's begin with eligibility, a popular topic. Eligible applicants are employed at tax-exempt organizations, and they're seeking funds to primarily support research activities. Our research grant dollars are not intended to primarily provide support for an intervention or the services. And the projects, as we have stated, must be relevant to youth ages 5 to 25 and in the United States. Once you have determined your eligibility, you may submit a letter of inquiry. And we view the letter of inquiry as a 5-page mini-proposal. It defines the study's key research questions and hypotheses, describes relevant literature and motivating theory, and offers a concise overview of the sampling, strategies, methods, measures, and analysis plans. Requests for improving the use of research evidence range from $100,000 to $1 million and can cover an award period of 2 to 4 years. The upper limit of $1 million reflects our interest in receiving bold research projects that are well positioned to advance the field. Letters of inquiry are accepted 3 times a year, and our next deadline is coming up on January 11th, 2017. All submissions are done electronically and are reviewed internally by at least 2 staff members for fit and quality. This process usually takes about 6 to 7 weeks. You may be interested to know that we have been reviewing about 150 letters per cycle, and about 1/3 of those are for the Improving the Use of Research Evidence initiative. About 15% of the letters reviewed are invited to submit a full proposal. Ultimately, about 5% of the letters are funded. Applicants sometimes ask for help while they're developing their letter of inquiry, but we are a small staff and generally not able to conduct phone calls, face-to-face meetings, or reviews of proposals prior to submission. Rather, we recommend that you engage with the materials posted on the Foundation's website and then submit your letter at one of the deadlines. We get the same question at the end of the letter of inquiry cycle, and applicants want to know if they can learn the specific reasons why their proposals weren't invited. While we do let everyone know of our decision and share some general feedback from our review of the proposal, we don't have the capacity to provide individual feedback at the LOI stage. The next stage of the process is the review of full proposals, and these invitations are generated by the letter of inquiry. Full proposals are more developed versions of the letter of inquiry and are accepted 3 times a year. They undergo a rigorous review process that lasts about 6 months. First, the proposal is critiqued by 2 or 3 external reviewers. We typically recruit 2 reviewers for their content and methodological expertise, and a 3rd reviewer for practice or policy. Next, promising proposals are reviewed by 2 members of the senior program team, which consists of our president, our vice president of programs, 2 senior research advisors, and our 2 program officers. Following this review, a few investigators are offered the opportunity to provide a written response to the concerns raised by all of the reviewers. Once complete, the senior program teams reviews this response and makes an initial recommendation for funding. These recommendations are then presented to our Board of Trustees for final approval. The entire review process, from the letter of inquiry stage to board approval, takes on average between 10 and 15 months. The full proposal review process occupies about 6 months of that time frame. And about 1/4 to 1/3 of those that submit a full proposal are recommended for board approval. Now that you have a sense of the review process, let's take a few moments to consider the content of the letter of inquiry. Sorry. We are often asked if we give preference to a particular research design or method. The answer is no. Instead, the research design should fit the question and provide credible evidence to support or challenge hypotheses about improving the use of research evidence. In this case, the 3 lines of inquiry that we discussed earlier in the webinar beg a range of designs, from experimental and observational studies to comparative case studies and systematic reviews. They also beg a number of different study types. We welcome descriptive studies meant to clarify the mechanisms for improving research use. For example, we recently funded William Firestone and Jill Perry to investigate changes to the education doctorate as a possible strategy for bolstering school district leaders' capacity to appraise and use research evidence. The team will examine how the pedagogies and the instructional practices used by the training program help future education leaders develop the skills to assess the credibility of research evidence and use it to define problems and design responses in their workplaces. We also welcome intervention studies that examine attempts to improve the use of research. For example, a randomized controlled trial might test whether an intervention that provides school with technical assistance and coaching on the use of research evidence is more likely to lead to the adoption of a research-based program. For both of these study types, an additional consideration is the need for longitudinal designs that allow for prospective data collection about research use. For example, longitudinal work could reveal whether a strategy creates sustained use of research evidence even through times of transition and staff turnover. We also welcome measurement studies. We recognize that the 3 lines of inquiry may require the modification of existing measures and the development of new measures. For example, hypothesis testing studies designed to monitor change in the nature or degree of research use as a result of manipulation need measures that are sensitive enough to capture changes in the research use over time and across conditions. It's an open question whether or not existing measures are equipped to deal with this challenge. In proposing work to advance measures, applicants need to present a strong theoretical and empirical rationale for the focal constructs to be measured. They need to share their plans for establishing the tool's reliability and validity and lay out a plan for refining the measure. Teams also need to demonstrate the utility of the tool beyond their proposed study. For example, in the first phase of the initiative, we supported the development of a structured protocol to assess how different stakeholders understand research and their level of engagement in acquiring, evaluating, and applying research evidence in the social service setting. The tool can now help agency leaders understand when research is called upon and how it's shared. And the protocol also helps researchers monitor the use of research evidence in social work practice and understands the conditions that support its use. A second important consideration concerns a construct that is central to every research project in this focus area, the use of research evidence. We encourage applicants to think critically about how your research team will conceptualize and measure the use of research. A first step is to define research evidence. As a reminder, we define research as empirical evidence derived from systematic methods and analyses. We do not equate research with data. A second step is to convey how you are conceptualizing the use of research evidence. Are you interested in studying the direct application of research to decision-making, conceptual influences on how decision-makers think about problems, or strategic uses to justify existing stances? These ideas should be situated within a larger theoretical framework. This will inform your efforts to build and test theories on how to create change. Equally important is offering an operational definition of research use and stating how this will be assessed in the study's measures and analysis plan. It should be easy for reviewers to discern the types of research use you are studying and how you will measure and analyze them. For example, if you are conceptualizing research as being instrumental and expect it to be evident in the course of a specific decision, such as what program to adopt, which caseloads to prioritize, or how to instruct or train, reviewers will want to know what information you're going to look at, listen to, or ask about to be convinced that an instrumental use of research evidence has occurred. These are challenging tasks, and when we read your letters of inquiry, we want to see that you have thought deeply about these issues and that your team has the methodological expertise you need to do the work. Applicants often want to know what makes a proposal on improving the use of research evidence competitive. Foundation staff have reviewed about 90 letters of inquiry and find the most successful proposals have the following qualities. They ground the study in prior theoretical and empirical work. This may draw, as I mentioned earlier, on work by the Foundation's grantees, or engage other traditions for studying how to strengthen connections between the research, practice, and policy communities. For example, improvement science can help us think about change management as it relates to introducing and integrating research evidence. And the fields of knowledge mobilization has a long history of developing strategies to advance knowledge. Successful letters of inquiry prioritize the research activities. We seek systematic studies on improving the use of research evidence. This means the research questions are primary and the change efforts are secondary. However, our call asks for studies that identify, create, or test strategies for improving use. And this has resulted in a number of proposals where the research activities are overwhelmed by the change effort. We encourage you to be clear up front about your research questions and hypotheses. We value letters that are focused on research use involving state and local decision makers and intermediaries. We rarely fund studies focused on the use of research evidence by frontline workers, such as teachers, caseworkers, and probation officers. Finally, successful letters of inquiry demonstrate how the project adds value to theory and directly or indirectly informs either policy or practice. This means the design, methods, and analyses are appropriate given what is already known. For instance, it is not enough to describe the extent and nature of research use. We know a lot about that already. The study must consider what is required to improve research use or understand the impact of research use on decision-making and use outcomes. As I also mentioned, honing existing measures or rigorously developing new ones is another way to push the field forward. To learn more about our interest in the application process, I encourage you to visit our website and review the guides and supplemental resources staff has spent considerable time developing and gathering. There's a few I'd like to point out. For insights about our grant application process, please look at our research application guide. We've also developed a supplemental statement that's specific to improving the use of research evidence initiatives. This both talks about the history of the Foundation's initiative and the 3 lines of inquiry I've outlined in this presentation. Last summer, I wrote a blog post on assessing your project fit. Again, this is based on the first 50 or so letters of inquiry we received and some observations and insights about what matters. Lastly, we have put both FAQs on our website and developed some annotated excerpts from successful proposals. These proposals we consider to be exemplar, although not on improving use of research evidence or on reducing inequality. They still embody the qualities that we look for and reviewers seek when they're conducting their critiques. I'm going to close here and take a few more questions before we end our webinar.
Kim, a number of listeners have written in with questions about measures, data and measures.
Okay.
So one set of questions has to do with whether federal, national, and state databases might be appropriate sources to look for measures. Another question is about whether data from the stakeholders themselves, presumably the body in which decisions are made that we're looking at, would be useful evidence under the use of research evidence strand.
Did you want to answer this? Okay. So we welcome data from a variety of sources, but data in and of themselves don't comprise research. As I said, they have to be subjected to rigorous, systematic methods and analyses for a predetermined question. And that creates a narrative, if you will, around the data that we would think of as research. If an organization has gone through that process and used their data to conduct research, then it's welcome to have a role if you want to see if you can mobilize it or integrate with how making sure they're using it in their practices. But the data in and of themselves wouldn't fit our definition of research.
Thanks, Kim. That's really helpful, and that actually helps me understand the listeners' questions. One of our listeners said, it was very explicit about this, would stakeholders' use of institutional data be of interest under this strand? And I think you've answered it by saying the stakeholders' use of the data is not what we mean by the use of research evidence. We mean data that's been analyzed, processed, put to a question. That's research.
Yeah.
Whether in the institutional stakeholders' own context or in another context.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not the use of data, it's the use of evidence from research that is the focus of this funding initiative. One other question about measures that I'd like to put to you is about whether we fund research on measures in this domain. The questioner's particular question was about taking measures from one domain like business and applying them elsewhere like in education. But in general, what's our stance on funding research on measurements in this domain?
Sure. We welcome measurement studies. This is a challenge for the field. There are a number of measures that exist that have been developed based on the questions that they're asking. So some are observational in nature, some are protocols for the network analysis, and others are based on the survey research. But as I mentioned, in our first phase of this initiative, we are very much focused on understanding how research was used. And now we're pushing on the idea of improving use of research. And we suspect that will call for modifications to existing measures and the development of new measures that can be sensitive to picking up changes in research use over time, as well as in response to particular manipulations or interventions or change efforts. So we certainly welcome bringing measures in from other areas and making the modifications that are necessary to fit our questions. And we'd just like to know the process for doing that, how you'll go about validating, demonstrating its reliability.
Hi, Kim. Another set of questions that came in from our viewers is the role of state and local decision makers. Could you say a little bit more about what we mean by that? And then also, can you say a bit about what we mean by intermediary?
Sure. So I'll just back up a second, is that we feel that folks who work in, who are mid-level managers, that can be within a state organization, it can be in a community-based organization, have a lot of responsibility and some space in their work to think about research. And this, we have been focused on this area because these individuals have the opportunity to think about how a problem is understood, how responses to those problems are constructed, how resources get allocated, strategic planning, how training gets done. And so we're very much focused on this mid-level manager system. It can be in, as I said, a state organization, a federal organization, a legislative body, but that's why we're valuing those roles, those decision-making roles. For the intermediaries, partly as a result of the research that was conducted in the early phase, we learned of their importance in this space, both in terms of networks between organizations and in the functions that intermediary organizations. Sometimes they do produce research and push it out, but often they play a liaison role and translate research, raise people's awareness, and provide opportunities for engagement around bodies of evidence. So we also think they're very important.
So here's one that I'd like to take.
Sure.
Kim, you emphasized the importance of rigorous research, that we would like to fund rigorous research. One listener would like to know, is this a code word for quantitative hypothesis testing research? And the answer is no. By rigorous, we mean research that is systematic, in which the design is aligned to the question, and the data is aligned to the design, and in which the data are analyzed in ways that respond to the question. And that holds for qualitative research, for mixed methods research, as well as for hypothesis testing research. I would particularly commend listeners to take a look at a paper in our annual digest on the value of qualitative methods for research on reducing inequality, because this is laid out there and applies to all of the research that we fund.
Great. So Adam, if I hear you correctly, you're equating rigor with quality research.
Yes.
Great.
Another listener would like to know, how are our external reviewers selected, and how does one volunteer to serve as a reviewer?
There's two great questions. So the first, we select our reviewers based on the proposal that's in front of us. So unlike many of the federal systems that have standing panels, when we get a proposal, we look at what its substantive focus is, as well as the methods that are used, and generate ideas for reviewers to recruit specific to that proposal. In terms of reviewing, you are welcome to send us an email with your CV. You can send it to kdumont@wtgrantfoundation.org, and we will look over, and if we have a proposal that fits well with your expertise, we are happy to ask you to do a review. Okay, well, unless we have more questions, I will move forward.
We got a couple more questions, Kim. Oh, there's more to go?
No. I mean, I just have one slide.
I got a couple more questions. Okay. So you have emphasized state and local. Oh, we did that. Oops. Okay. Good answer to that question. Okay. What about
yes.
Okay. One more question. Last question is about this one from way much earlier in the.
The questions are real time, so they're live coming in. We have hundreds of questions. They're sorting through as the webinar is going on, so just give us a moment.
So one listener wants to know about routine outcome monitoring and feedbacking. Routine outcome monitoring and feedback data in a mental health service organization. And this listener is envisioning an intervention study that changes the organizational culture in ways that support mid-managers' use of research. Is that something that might hit our target?
It's possible would be my answer, and I would encourage you to submit a letter of inquiry. I think that certainly we're interested in the idea of organizational change to create bigger spaces and a higher valuing of research evidence. The question will be whether the data monitoring, if that is what you're equating with research evidence, it was unlikely it would be a fit. However, if it's a tool that you're thinking would change the organizational culture to create, and you can demonstrate research use is more likely in an organization that uses that approach, then that would be a fit. So we would need to see the full letter of inquiry to evaluate it.
Yeah, and another question probably gets the same answer. This is a question about funding a technology development project to improve the use of research evidence. And so I think if the focus is research to understand whether some technological tool improves the way evidence is used to make decisions, then it's likely to be a good fit with our competition. If the funds being sought are to develop a piece of technology, then it's less likely that that would be a good fit for our competition.
I would like to add one thing that both of these questions make me think about. Sometimes people start with a tool for changing the culture, and the body of research evidence or the evidence-based program are really secondary, and they don't get described in the proposal. We want to know why it's important that the decision makers need to engage with a particular body of research evidence, and so we need you to tell us what that research evidence is.
Thank you.
Vivian?
Give me 1 second.
Could you comment about the role of policy in this initiative to support research on the use of research evidence? So, for example, what do we expect the policy implications might be of the research findings that our grantees uncover?
Yeah, this is a good question because we do, as one of our requirements, like it to be relevant to policy. And we don't expect a single study to have an impact on policy, but as a group, it's important. So one could imagine that if we take the third line of inquiry around whether or not research use in decision making, or I'll take that first one on improving research. If we learn that a particular strategy, say federal and state agencies offering incentives to take up research evidence is effective, one could imagine that that affects their strategies and policies for improvement down the road.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
That's right. So Kim, one of our viewers wrote in that you mentioned that the William T. Grant Foundation rarely funds grants on frontline workers, including teachers. Would you also include building level principals and coaches, frontline workers, and with that?
Great. Great question. So I would put the principals as mid-level management. They are, again, making decisions. The way that we, and the coaches, that's a trickier one, and I think we need to see your rationale for why you would put the coaches. Curriculum instructors would be easier to think about as being a mid-level manager. Again, they're in charge of training. The coach is almost like a frontline worker in the sense that they're making decisions on the spot, and it would be hard to see how their research evidence is used. But we'd be open to a compelling justification for that. Well, I want to thank everyone for their great questions and taking time today to join us for this webinar. We really hope that it's been useful. And we hope to see your letters of inquiry. We have 3 opportunities coming up in 2017, both for the Improving User Research Evidence Initiative and for the Reducing Inequality Initiative. Our next deadline is January 11th by 4 p.m. Eastern Time, and then May and August are the dates that follow that. So we wish you a good afternoon, hope this has been a good use of your time, and look forward to reading your letters. Thank you.